All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second Tamio webinar. It looks like we've got most of our folks who have already logged in and are on our Zoom chat here. I'm Jay Warren, the Director of Communication and Legislative Affairs for the City of Arlington, and also your Tamio President. And we are thrilled so many of you have joined us for this session. It's another way to not only have our Tamio members join in and continue the learning process, but also we've invited communicators from across Texas to join us as well and participate in this session. We started these monthly webinars last month as a part of an effort as we go through this course of this year to continue the learning and the engaging and the connecting, not just keeping that at our annual conference that we would normally have if not for coronavirus, but really keeping that learning going throughout the entire year, which I think will really be helpful to all of us. Today's topic is one that we all face, I think, and at least one that many of us, and I know I do, struggle with as well, which is how to gather community input and how to use that input then effectively. We've got the perfect person to answer those questions for us today, Kevin Lyons. Many of you know Kevin, I'm sure. He has been a regular at our Tamio conferences as well as at 3CMA conferences. He is the co-founder of FlashVote, which provides statistically valid community input in 48 hours to government decision support. A little bit about Kevin. He has formal training from the Business and Public Policy PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley. He has PhD work in engineering as well. His bio notes that he has spent 25 years learning about good governance from Nobel-winning theorists and award-winning historians. I wrap that all up in another way of saying that he is the ideal data nerd to tackle this topic for us today. So Kevin, we're really happy you're with us. Before I hand it over to you, let me just do a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to leave ample time throughout the session for questions. If you've got them, please put them in the Q&A section here on Zoom. I'll interject if we need to in the middle of the webinar to ask the question, or we'll ask and answer them hopefully at the end of the session as well. Second, the best way for you all to view the presentation, if you haven't already done so, would be go up to the top of your bar, the box of speakers that you see there, and select one of three viewing options. If you pick the option that is displayed with one bar, you'll see only one speaker at a time, and this will allow you to see all the slides in the presentation while also seeing the speaker while Kevin is talking. We will record this session and we'll post it on the Tamio website for reference in the next day or two. You can find that under Learn and Share. All right, enough announcements, enough from me. Let's get to Kevin Lyons and learn a little bit more about data and how to use it effectively. Kevin.
All right, thanks a lot, Jay. Excited to be here talking with one of my favorite groups ever, Tamio. Love the conference and love communicators. So sorry you have to put up with a data nerd for an hour here, but we'll try to keep it moving fast. If it goes too fast, don't worry, we'll share the slides, whatever you want, you can reach out afterwards. And we're in the feedback business, so keep in mind, what do you like most, what do you like least as we blast through stuff. Cool, so the first thing to start with here is the next slide. Boom. So what do you want to know? There's this great saying, don't tell me what you do, tell me what you do for me. Let's test the chat real quick. If there's anything you're hoping to get out of today, throw it into the chat, and then maybe Jay or someone can tell us that it's working, because we're going to try some experimentation and making the Zoom a little more interactive. So tell me what you want to know. And that way I can maybe emphasize, spend a little more time on something or spend a little less time on something as well.
Yeah,
while you're doing that,
Q&A is working because we've already got one kind of post in there. So I think we're live on that, so we're good.
Excellent. All right, great. So feel free to do that anytime during the thing and ask questions as well. Just to tell you where we're going, I'm going to start out telling you kind of what data is helpful. How does it fit into what you do? And then we'll use some COVID data to highlight some lessons about good and bad data, and then get into the core thing, the science of public input and public input data, and then talk more generally about, and specifically, some tips and tricks about how you can get really good data and manage the data you get, the input you get from people as a government. And we'll wrap up and hopefully have a little time for some questions. So what data is helpful? tell you a quick little story here. There's basically two ways to move rocks. So during the quarantine, my project was to do something with the yard that was completely sloped and rocky and basically useless. And it turns out that rocks are heavy and they don't move very far. And there's better ways. I had no idea that any idiot can rent an excavator for a couple $100, but I got that tip from a friend. And this is proof that any idiot can rent an excavator. It's unbelievably easier to move rocks, and your project can expand. You can get more done if you do things differently with that little bit of data that I had, that little tip. So working harder is great. You can get more done. 1 extra hour is 1 extra hour. I did move rocks before I get the excavator, a few, and then my back started to hurt because I'm getting old. And then there's also the better processes and tools where 1 extra hour actually in thinking about how to move rocks didn't even take that long. Many hours saved, right? So that's kind of the working harder and smarter. You've heard that before. That's actually kind of duh, right? In the government context, though, we have a lot of examples where working smarter is obviously a great thing to do. If you're familiar with the Denver Peak Academy, City of Denver, they invested 4.8 million over 4 years, and they saved 15 million. So almost 4 million a year. Home run, slam dunk. But I want you to think about something else that we call working wiser. So harder is kind of that more time and effort. How much do you do? Smarter is the better processes and tools, how you do it. What about the what to do? The better knowledge and judgment. What's that worth? So you can compare the smarter, which is fantastic, great 3x return on that, to working wiser. And one example is $5,000 invested in a survey saved $7 million. They've realized that they shouldn't do this thing at all because people didn't value it and actually had negative impacts. Just one decision. That's a 1,000x return. And we don't think about that layer that much, but it turns out to be incredibly important and valuable. And it wins every time, that little investment in knowledge. But how do you get wiser? Ultimately, it's just better data for better decisions. Knowing what people want, value. It's a problem in startups, it's a problem in governments. How do you actually find out what your customer wants? And the what to do really matters. So I got a little carried away with the excavator, started making yard, and literally to this day, we have done absolutely nothing with this nice, flat, clean area. Oops, kind of a waste, but there was one tip I did get, and that was to put in a trampoline on this other little corner from my daughter. And that has been the home run during the pandemic. And I've required input for that. I don't use the trampoline that much, probably shouldn't either. So for you, think of it smarter, working smarter, how to do. Data can be helpful there. Facts, ideas, feedback, really useful. And then wiser. How do you work wiser? Well, that's community preferences. What do people really want? What do they really value? Not just a few noisy voices, but the community as a whole, the public as a whole that we all serve as public officials. And the returns are magical. 2 to 10x for working smarter with great ideas, tips, suggestions. Working wiser, they're almost ridiculous, unbelievable. You can save millions, tens of millions, I think hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on the project, by tweaking it to what people really want. Okay, so of course there's some challenges to that. We're not statisticians, naturally. None of us, not me. Maybe some of you guys are, but 5 out of 4 Americans, for example, do not understand statistics. But the real problem is what we see in front of our eyes becomes our universe. It's what we think everyone thinks when 10 angry people come to a meeting. And it's hard to get out of that. Well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes, right? Me is the data. The public that's in the room as data when they're not actually in the room. Okay, so pause for any questions real quick that popped up. Jay, anything? Sounds good. Let's move on to some COVID data.
There we go.
Go ahead.
We've got a couple people are interested in learning the most efficient ways to get good input, which I think you'll probably touch on. We also
yes.
Ask how do we get information or input from the non-frequent flyers, I think is the best way to summarize that. So
the non-usual suspects, someone
Yes,
besides
yes.
the TUS, right? Yeah, terrific. Okay, so let's dive into some data. I missed my joke timing here, but basically this is a real equation from self-selection. Don't worry about it. We're kidding. This is what I want to connect with you on. Connect the dot. I'll try to keep it real simple, real understandable, but don't be shy about questions if something didn't click. Okay, so sampling, data samples, non-frequent flyers, for example, in public input. We're on the first poll here. We'll do a real quick 1-minute poll. I'm going to launch it and just jump in real quick. What do you think the chances of dying from COVID? Random people get it. All right, anyone getting the poll? Yeah, there we go. People are starting to take it. Just real quick, just guess. We're not grading here. Good. Good turnout here. Already at 50% response rate. That's excellent. All right, cool. All right, I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We've got 80% response rate. And we have results. So it looks like most people are in the 0.1 or less, 0.2 to 5, or 0.6 to 1%. So literally 60% or 5.5 or less. It's a smart group. I'll share the results just so you can see them. To get a snapshot if you want, and stop sharing the results. Okay. So what is the risk of dying? You guys are smarter than this, but here's the typical way people think about it. This is the data from a few days ago, August 14th. Certain number of deaths, certain number of cases. Hey, let's divide, right? So 3% of cases lead to deaths. Very sad, very large number. No matter how you look at it. But hold on, who's actually been tested? Are we testing everyone? We're testing sick people? Maybe exposed people? Maybe volunteers? Some of them anyway. If anyone's tried to get a test, it's still not easy. Are the people in that sample, this is the question you always ask, the same as the people not in that sample? This is why you want to hear from those not frequent flyers, because you have a feeling, a sense that they're different than the people you are hearing from. And then you want to ask, how might they be different? Right? So sick people, fortunately, are not representative of everyone. Exposed people are not. And volunteers are not. They're volunteering for a reason. So what would you really want? A random sample. That would be good. That's kind of the standard, the gold standard for data. So yeah, if you want to know the actual risk of people that are infected, you need to know all infections, not just the cases that have actually been tested, because there's a ton of cases that haven't. And the random sample is really important because you don't want that sample of people to be related to the positive test results, like sick people. You know, sick people are probably going to be the people that have positive test results more than people outside the sample. Uncorrelated, basically fancy word for co-related. They move together. So if you think of a test like, have you ever had COVID, the blood test? The first antibody test was in April. Maybe you heard about this. They found by doing a sample of people that were not just volunteers, sick people or exposed people, they found 50, 85 times more cases. Well, that's really interesting. That was big news. So instead of 0.15% of the county having tests, their estimate was that about 3% of the county had tests, right? So instead of 1,000 cases, there were 54,000 cases, which means that the actual fatality rate was not 5%, calculated the way we just did, but 0.1. That's really good news. Bad news is there's only 3% infected, a lot more to go, but the good news is 0.1 is the same as the seasonal flu. But wait a minute, 3,300 volunteers for the test, oops, they were kind of volunteers, were recruited from Facebook ads. So they sampled like a Facebook poll. Scientists from Stanford did this. This is like the most horrible thing you could imagine, right? Yeah. So it took a couple of days And statisticians were all over these people. One of the top metadata people at Stanford got really embarrassed over this one. The authors owe us all an apology because they sampled, not random, not uncorrelated. They said they did a Facebook ad to get people to come. So what happened in their case? Well, that 0.1 IFR is too low because there was too many positives. The people that volunteered did have a reason for volunteering. On the other hand, as we've already talked about, that 3% IFR is too high. Right? The confirmed case sample is also sicker people compared to the overall population. So what's the right guess right now? CDC range 0.2 to 1. And my guess of 0.3 to 0.5 is actually based on tons of antibody tests that have been done. And you can click on them if you look at it. So the right answer, you guys are right there, smack dab in the middle, wisdom of the crowd. How about that, huh? 0.2 to 0.5 is the best guess right now. Good work. And a lot of smart data people just made basic mistakes from the beginning, including the WHO, the World Health Organization, where they actually said it was 3.4% when it started. Okay, so bottom line is self-selection. Who you're hearing from, who's participating in your sample compared to who's not in the sample. That's what makes COVID data useless, testing data, some of it. It's improved since then, fortunately, and public input data too. All right, so the second thing, aggregating data. What does that 0.4% risk, just taking the midpoint, 0.3 to 0.5, mean for you personally as you think about this? Almost nothing. Here's the risk by age. So if you lump all the ages together, you get 0.4%. But if you're young, it's a lot lower than if you're older. It's pretty serious when you're older. This is some data I compiled months ago from 5 countries. So under 30 in Texas, the percent of Texans under 30 is just about 43%. Think about what do you think the percent of deaths is under 30 in Texas from COVID? Wait a second. 0.9% of all COVID deaths, 87 total. So a lot lower. Meanwhile, 75 or older, 4.4%, and the percent of deaths 75 or older is 46%. Wow, right? So almost half the deaths are people 75 or older. And by the way, I pulled this directly from your Texas site. I was going to make some pretty graphs. Anyone see a problem with this data? There's 784 confirmed cases in the 75 to 79 range, but there's 1,200 deaths. So there's more deaths than cases, which means your data is kind of junk here, unfortunately, for the confirmed cases in Texas. This data is usually reliable, sadly. Okay, so the aggregated data hides the really useful information depending on your particular age. 65 and up is 30 times the risk of under 50. 80 and up is 150 times the risk of under 30. Right? 0.4 really tells you almost nothing without age. You need to disaggregate to get information. And in surveys we've done, people seem to know these age risks. They're pretty well aware. So if you look at, we asked, which of the following is your biggest concern? This is about COVID. Done this for a bunch of cities. Financial health, mental health, or physical health. And if you look by age, the 30 and under, 31 to 45, 46 to 60, and 61 and over, there's like almost a 3-to-1 difference where health is the #1 concern. And the other ones are kind of the same by age. Physical health versus financial health, pretty much the same. But if you look at it all blobbed together, you take away that extra insight. It kind of looks like everyone's concerned about physical health, but they're not the same by age. So over-aggregation creates confusion about COVID risks and about community needs, by the way. If you aren't breaking down by neighborhood potentially, or by age, by gender, all kinds of things you can look at to understand the whole broad community needs. Okay, lastly, context. Here's a quick poll again, gonna launch it. Which condition disproportionately affects? Launch #2 here. Older people. And can we take the poll? Go for it. There's a 120-day mortality rate of 1%. That means you get this condition, and in 120 days later, you have a 1% chance of dying. All right, results are coming in, flying in. Good job, everybody. Looks like most people are coming up with the flu is number 1, heart attack is number 2, and then cancer and dementia are distant number 3, and then other. Okay, I'll give it another 5 seconds. Get your answers in there. Good, we got over 70% so far. All right, flu's a clear winner here. I'll end it and share results in case you want to snapshot it. Okay. And stop that. So what's the answer? Uh-oh. Other, turning 75. Whoa. Just being old is actually the risk. And we kind of forget this context when we look at the risk of COVID by age. This is the risk of being alive by age. Compiled this from actuarial data from the Social Security Administration. It spikes up. Very similar looking curve. In fact, if you put both curves, the normal risk from just being alive versus the COVID risk, they track each other really tightly. This is a logarithmic scale for data nerds, but it's remarkable. So that context is really useful. After I gave this talk previously, a version of this to 3CMA, someone sent me this graph. The relative risk of death from flu versus COVID. And it turns out for really young people, flu is actually more dangerous. There's been 1 death under 18 in all of California, for example. But it really jumps up when you get to be, 15 and above. And that's where COVID is a lot more dangerous. I haven't validated these numbers directly, but this shape of this curve I have validated. So is it just the flu? No, it's not. No, seasonal flu is 0.1 IFR. We already know from New York City, as the latest data, that 0.28 of the population has actually caught COVID and died. So that is already 0.3%. So you can't have an infection rate that is more than the population. And the latest antibody tests are 0.5% IFR there. Also, if you're still not convinced, you can look at the excess deaths in a place like Europe, and there's a huge spike. So very different from flu. About 3 to 5 times as deadly is the best estimate. And there's 2 times as many targets because half of the people are not vaccinated, although it does look like some people may have some pre-existing immunity from other coronaviruses, which is good news. So deadliest for older age groups, and that is actually the mistake we made. Good data told us to protect the elderly and sick, actually overprotect. And yet in the US, nursing homes, 0.6 of the population, 42% of the deaths. Canada, 1.2% of the population, 81% of the deaths. Amazing. Same in Sweden and other places. Jurisdictions miss this data in the context of the relative risks, and it costs lives. It's very sad. So the wrong data or context has led to real COVID missteps. And of course, it could also lead to normal bad agency decisions, not on that scale, fortunately. All right. There we go. So science of public input. Think of those lessons: self-selection, over-aggregation, and context. Apply those every day. All right, so which best describes how you feel about online polls and surveys? Gonna go to the next poll here, and a launching. So go ahead. Gut feel, again, not grading you. We'll get to the answers at the end of the whole thing for this one, but it's interesting what people say. Okay, good. Wow, good quick response. We're already at 70% response here. So running away, probably not great, but better than nothing. Like 71% of people are on that. And then good data, maybe 10%, bad data, like 10%. Okay, I'm gonna end it now in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and sharing the results for you to get a little snapshot. Yeah, probably not great, but better than nothing. Okay, hold that thought. We'll see see how that shapes up at the end. So, whoops, get this out of the way. Let's talk about the word input real quick. It's an interesting word. It used to mean a sum of cash put in, a sharing contribution. And then it evolved to be energy supplied to a device or machine. You can just see history evolving here. And nowadays, it means data fed into a machine. So what is that machine for public communications? Well, the machine is actually pretty simple if you break it down. We all know this idea of a fiduciary org chart, boss, employee, principal agent is the generic way to think about it. You hire a plumber or whatever. Hey, do X, you give instructions, and then, okay, did X. Your toilet's unclogged. That's the full communications loop. That is basically everything you need to know when it's one-to-one. Super simple. Okay, so what happens though when we have thousands of citizens that get together, pool some money, some property, some behaviors, and then hire some people to execute? Well, how would that work? You see any problems with that? Thousands of people. I use this example, just a simple Google Assistant. My daughter will say, hey, play Ariana Grande, or play what does the fox say, or something awful. And I'll say no, right? And so what does Google do? Even two people, it's hard. What does that mean? What does it mean to say do X when you have multiple people? It's chaos. So we have to do something else. We actually have to select some people. We call it selectmen historically in New England, where I grew up. Someone has to make that official decision. So then now you have some more chunks in this communications loop. Citizens have to talk to the board has to talk with the staff has to talk to themselves because there's more than one, and then they have to report back to the board has to report back to the citizens, and you still have these outer ones too. Oh yeah, and there's more than one citizen, so they have to figure out what they want too, right? So that's your loop. It's complicated. There's a lot going on there. The logic and the structure is the same, but feel free to snapshot it. I'm not going to talk about it right now. Each one of these pieces was well defined. You can think about how you're doing on each one of these different pieces, different talk. We're going to talk about the core communications input, which is how do the residents give their input to the staff and to the board. And that's these two. So from citizens to the board, got to get direction and feedback on broad public needs, interests, and priorities. And the staff got to give feedback and suggestions as to the performance of specific activities, right? If there's a pothole over here, or this thing broke, or hey, have you thought about doing this, right? Useful stuff when you can get it. The other way to think about it is it's just the channels we all are familiar with. So I grew up in a town that's almost 400 years old, and literally this is how communications work. Hear ye, public meeting. They still use those words today in their meeting announcements. Now we have tons of different options based around digital website and so on, right? But ultimately, think of your blocks. You got kind of government to one person, government to many, and then on the input side, one to gov and many to gov. We know the traditional tools. Ultimately, there's new tools that we're dealing with. We don't really use the messengers so much, or the town crier, but email, social, texts, email blasts, posts, live stream, right? And then on the input side, still get phone calls, still have elections, petitions, scientific surveys like George Gallup created in the 30s. But we're really more using email, online forums, web surveys like we talked about in the poll, petitions, panels. Town meetings actually still work really well. 1,000 people show up. So the interesting thing is if you look at all of these channels, all the gov to one, all the gov to many, all the one to gov, and the many to gov, there's really only one channel that works on the many to gov. That's kind of that surveys, petitions, mass input. And there's problems with that, getting good representative input. Right? Now, if you're not sure why we need the community input, Here's the citizens' perspective. We've actually done a lot of polling with this, worked a ton, one-to-one, and with citizen groups. Which org chart would you rather be in? Think about this. This is not an IQ test. It's pretty simple, right? Citizens at the top, government at the top, citizens. So we ask citizens this, right? Yeah. Every one of them says, well, yeah, I want to be this one. Okay, great. Now, which org chart is democracy? We ask them. And again, they're, is it theoretical? Is it real? Yeah, no, they all get it. That's the whole point. That's what we celebrate on July 4th. Is flipping from the king on the top to the citizens on the top. Okay, now which org chart feels most like reality? Think about that. Interesting. This is what everyone says, and you're probably thinking the same thing. Government and citizens. And then we ask which org chart is established by law. And people kind of go, wait a minute, it's like B, but it's got to be A, right? So they get confused. There's a split. Now you guys know the answer because we've all seen the org charts we work in when we're as officials or whatever. And there's a problem. There's a disconnect. So we all want A to be reality, right? Public servants, public masters. I serve on an advisory board for the last 7 years for the Washoe County. You know, what do you want? What should we do here? How do we serve the public as a whole? We'll do what you want. Absolutely, that's great. Makes everyone happy. But we don't hear from everybody. It's that unrepresentative input leads to the perception of B. That's the problem, right? You're just doing what you want. Well, actually, no, we're doing what we heard from a few people we should do, and that's all we had. And oh, geez, why are you so mad at us, right? What do you want us to do? Representative input solves that problem. And we did a survey at Tamio a couple of years ago, actually. What % of Texas governments have had decisions influenced by a few noisy people? Think about it for just a second, and boom, almost everybody. And of course, what % should be influenced by a few noisy people instead of by consideration and interest of the public as a whole, and that's 0. So there's a challenge here. And residents see this when we talk with them, when we survey them. It's my favorite interesting citizen perspective. American people hire high-powered lobbyists to push interest in Congress. So this is the onion coming through strong, as usual. There was another one, and perspective, and this is, I accidentally referred to this as performance art in a talk once. I hope it isn't. But politicians at the top of an outhouse and voters at the bottom. That's how they feel. We can do better with input, getting true input. Okay, so now your perspective. Why do you need that broader input? The ManaGov. Imagine that 10,000 people are chipping in for pizza, and you have to figure out which toppings to get. Think about how you might do that. It's a real pizza, by the way. Looks pretty good. How do you figure this out? Here's the org chart, 10,000 people, all these different pizza topping options, and then you, and then the pizza chefs. Well, are you going to order what you want? That would not be cool. People would not like you. You're going to ask your friends what they want and then order that. Both of these fall in that category of corruption in local government, of course. No. What if you called a meeting? Not a public meeting about pizza toppings. What do you think is going to happen? Well, the anchovy people might show up, 10 of them out of 11 or out of 20 or whatever it is, and you're going to get an overrepresentation of anchovies in those pizzas that you order. People are not going to be happy about that. What about social media? You're going to put out some posts or ask for input, and then friends of Pineapple Pizza are going to show up and dominate the media post, right? These are the problems. You're familiar with these. You'd never do any of these. Online engagement, same thing. Who's going to find out about it? Who's going to participate? Who's going to give you their feedback? People with extra interest. Online survey, same thing. They find out about it, they take it at higher rates, they share it, they take it multiple times if they're interested. So you know all of these are terrible ways to try to figure out what pizza toppings to order. But unfortunately, we still do these in governments. They're influential. That's how you get that 97%, in fact. that are influenced. The right answer, take everyone's order. Now that's not always practical. So there happens to be another one, and that's a good sample, a scientific survey of orders. Then you're going to end up at least not overrepresenting the anchovy people. Nothing against the anchovies. They're not terrible. But they're not what the public wants. We know that from real survey data. Okay, so why do governments need this representative community input? You got a sense for it there, but now we can talk about some real examples. First survey we were ever involved with was proposed garbage service change. And I was talking with a friend who was on the board. He said, hey, you know, a majority are in favor and the rest don't give a crap. I said, that's awesome. That's a pure win. You want to flash vote it? And he said, yeah. So we were shocked. We actually found 2-to-1 were actually against. Everyone who had talked to him online at meetings, everything else was gung-ho. But there was for reasons no one had thought of, non-obvious flaws, and they actually came up with some better alternatives to address the actual problems that this policy was designed to address, which in this case was bears, where I live. But they found things like, oh gosh, people don't have garages. I have a garage, he had a garage, but you drive around town, all of a sudden you realize half the people don't have garages to put containers, which are normally a great solution. So what happened in this case was the board voted against. They avoided 10 years of a service that actually does not fit the community. It fits normal communities, flat communities, people with garage communities, but not this particular mountain rocky one where you need to build backyards. And it saved $7 million, and you'll recognize that as the example. Very first survey we did, and I was hooked on this kind of data thing in the government context. So that may be obvious to you, but what about citizens? Why do they need the representative community input? Why do they need to know what other people think as well, as opposed to just the noisy few? All right, last poll. Think of 1972 in the South. What % of whites do you think favored segregation? Some of you are old enough to remember, like me. Others may not be, but take a guess. Okay, the poll is open. 1972, 4 years after the big civil rights activities. Okay. Results are flying in. We're already at 60%. And, okay, I'll give it another 5 or seconds or so. Get your guess in there. So just take a wag at it. Okay, cool. So we've got about 75%. I'm going to close it, end the polling, and share the results. 21 to 40 is the main guess, but got a lot over 80. A lot over 60, about 20%. 41 to 60. This is typical guess range, right? Because segregation was a policy. Okay, hold that thought. So it turns out that someone did a survey on this, scientific survey. And the right answer was 15%. Only 15% actually favored segregation in 1972. But what % of whites believe the majority of whites in their area favored segregation? They see the protests in the news against desegregation. They see the violence. That's what they see outside. Take a guess. 72%. So reality was 15%, but people thought 72, they thought they were the outlier who didn't favor it. And so a policy like this went on for decades, potentially, when people didn't want it at all, because they didn't have that data. They didn't know what the community want. They were those noisy few dominated the conversation, and they thought they were the conversation too. It's not just the people in the government. All right, so sounds great, right? So we need this kind of input, but how do you get it? Well, there's a general challenge, unfortunately. And that is, who do you hear from in your community? Well, the edges, right? Yeah, in fact, usually the haters. Does that tell you that they're the tip of the iceberg? That everyone's kind of lining up behind them? Or does it tell you this, that they're the outliers? And the problem is you actually have no idea. You've been there in a meeting. People come up and yell, and it starts to feel like that's everyone. It feels like this, right? Oh, God, everyone hates us. This is terrible. There's a huge problem. Maybe, maybe not. You need the data. You need to know what the regular folks, the non-frequent flyers think. So we actually have some data on this perception. How often maybe does it compare one way or the other? One example is park quality. So there's a city in Southern California that had to cut back on park maintenance, and they got nothing but complaints, literally. Everyone hates the parks is what they're thinking, and the morale was crushed in the department. They did a survey of this, and it turns out that actually people loved it. They got a 4.0 out of 5. They were hearing from this, the 0.3%, and that's all they were hearing from, so they thought their whole curve was this, but it wasn't. Another one that was our first school survey, sex ed, so dove in with a really hot topic, and this is what they believed. There was people that hated it, and there was a people like super in favor of it in kind of a little uncomfortable way, and that was based on, they actually did a SurveyMonkey survey, right? So there was a ton of people that agreed that this topic, this curriculum's great, and a ton of people that said it's terrible. It was a reverse of like a normal curve. It was a barbell distribution. That's what you get with self-selection. So we happened to come in and do the same survey. Turns out there was 90% support. It was about 85 to 90, low 90s% for each of the elements. Completely different. That's what happens when you get that representative feedback. Game changing. More recently, we've seen lockdown protests, and we've done some surveys in California, for example. Things will open up too slowly. The economy will get a lot worse. That was 38% of people. Okay. The protests are super visible. This is what's behind the protests. It turns out actually majority of people were still a little concerned, right? Things opened up too fast and the outbreak will get a lot worse. So let it get a lot worse. So that was not a tip of an iceberg. It was less. It's actually the bulk is over here, the quiet majority. Police protests, another one, right? How's the backing look for that? Well, in that case, fully justified and partially justified actually dominate. So that's one where they are the tip of the iceberg. And in that case, 82% actually justified versus not justified. See the difference? You got to know what's behind that noise so you don't get confused like people in 1972 in the South, unfortunately. Okay. I was going to show you a video how quickly input goes bad. The short answer is about 10 minutes. So we did a survey on backyard chickens. Hotter the topic, the worse the data is going to be for you. And about 10 minutes for the Friends of Chickens people to find the open link. So we had the scientific sample. And I'm going to take a drink of water here while I just show you the difference. Boom. That's what happens. Regular people care a little bit. Self-selected people usually care a lot. Okay. So can you get away with no data? Maybe you're thinking about that. Well, how often is public input misleading based on all the data points we have now? Take a guess. When are they representative of the majority or the bulk, and when are they not? It turns out they're usually misleading, unfortunately. But you can't ignore them because sometimes they're not. It'd be super easy if they were always misleading. You could just do the opposite of what the noisy people do. You can't avoid having that input, unfortunately. So no data is not real. But if you were to just guess, ignore everything, what percentage of upgrades by Google and other companies are not improvements when tested? These are their best guesses at what people want. And they actually have feedback, 50%. It's kind of mind-boggling. They actually build something. They're so convinced it's going to work that they build it, and then they test it, and they go, oops, people didn't want it. So there's no luck with guessing. Doesn't work either. Okay, so you got everything down. More decisions with data. Need good data to make good decisions. Now let's talk about how to get good data. Okay, so how to get good data and avoid bad. Going all the way back to the beginning, there's two types of helpful data. Remember these? So we've got this smarter, work smarter, how to do stuff, the facts, ideas, feedback, the individual input. One person could give you any useful data. And then there's the what to do, which requires the community preferences, the working wiser. So this is basically the two types of input that are useful. And in that, everything else is noise. And you have to learn to ignore, and I'll give you a few tips on that shortly. The key is, though, that not all that input's good, needs to be valid. So you can think about facts about opinions. Those are good. That's essentially your scientific community preference measurement. Facts about facts. Hey, there is a pothole on this street, and there actually is. Or, hey, you could try this. It's worked for this city over here. Valid, true observations or ideas. Then below that, now we're in the useless and dangerous zone. So opinions about facts, unverified, uninformed, misinformation that you see on social media, opinions about opinions. Everyone hates this, or we need this, right? Those are garbage. They are not helpful. So you've narrowed it down even more. At the end of the day, these true facts can be helpful at both levels, at the kind of the board level decisions, the what to do, and the staff level. And usually the community preference is kind of at that board level, project level, and the individual facts are most useful at the staff level. But sometimes you can't, sometimes you get surprised, and you might be managing a project where there's some community preference level at the staff department level, whatever. Same with individual facts. Hey, have we tried this? This city, my cousin lives in a town that did this thing and it worked great. Who knows? One way to think about community preference data is in terms of when you don't need it. So if I ask you, do you want something that's awesome? Well, I don't even have to ask you. The answer is yes. If I ask you, do you want to pay more taxes? Again, I don't have to ask you. The answer is no, of course not. But do you want to pay for something awesome? Well, maybe. Now we're in trade-off land, right? And so, what is the awesome thing? How much does it cost? This is really where you don't need input. Community preferences. You want to get more and pay less? Well, yeah, of course the public wants you to do that. Right? You want to get less but pay more? Well, no, of course the public doesn't want you to do that. But now we're asking, do you want to pay more and get more? A new park, change to a service, or do you want to give up something and pay less? Put those resources somewhere else. That's trade-off land. That's where you need public input, and that's where you don't on that other diagonal. So you got to ask about the trade-offs to find out the right answers. Just to give you an example, recycling. So a lot of cities are having this issue. Costs are going up. China's not taking the recycling anymore and sorting it. So you can basically either pay more to keep the service the same, can pay the same, do the sorting yourself, pay the same, cut from weekly to 2 weeks, or give it up. And when we've surveyed on this, turns out people like it, they really do, but they're not willing to pay more. So they'd rather do a little more work, which kind of fits with the ethos of recycling, it turns out. They're also willing to go maybe 2 weeks instead of weekly. But any of these are valid answers. They're all in that trade-off land. And so in general, when you have those trade-offs, that's a good time to think about the data. All right, so how not to get it. You gotta have three things for community preference data. Unbiased responses that are not self-selected, and so really high response rate. Large number of representative responses. So 250 to 600 is ideal. 100 is pretty good. That's plus or minus 10% if it's a good sample. And then well-structured questions and answers. Right? These are unbiased questions targeted to what the residents know, not uninformed opinion like political polls. Meetings usually don't check that box with large numbers. Participation may not be representative of all ages, ethnicities, incomes, however you want to break it down. And you may not get the most constructive and informed input. I'm just, speculating for you guys. Just a little data out there. Emails, in fact, actually, this had a customer that counted every email they got for or against a project, 86% against. Turned out that the emails were not representative. Of course, they'd self-organized themselves. They did not have a majority against when we surveyed. Social media, similar thing. Posters are not representative of non-posters, thank God. There's 100 viewers for every post, and they're silent. And online engagement stuff, right? Again, it attracts people interested. This was a city in Texas, actually, I believe, just not to pick on anyone, but they This is the responses they got for particular projects. So no one out here was responding. People who lived here were not representative of the people not responding. And to the online surveys, well, 85% were in favor of a community center in an online survey. Turns out the real answer was 33%, and they saved like $30 million. What goes wrong? People follow the topics they're interested in. They participate in a topic because of their interest. They tell like-minded friends to participate. They can participate multiple times. Those are the things you have to get around with data. If you don't, you get a snowball sample. They tell two friends and so on. They roll down the hill, and you get junk data that's amplified and feels even worse because a ton of people gave it to you. Okay, how to get it valid. Scientific mailed surveys. You can do these yourself. Postcards are pretty affordable. There's services that do it. This is the catch. Older people are 16% of the US, but they really take those surveys. Half of them will come from older retired people, kind of like your meetings. All right. Scientific phone surveys. What do you think the response rate was in 1980? These are the random digit dial. Used to get 72%, really good. High sample within your sample of random calls. 20 years ago, still 61%. What do you think it is today? Think about it. 1%, 0.9. Yeah, it's terrible. So there's issues with that. That's why people like Pew and Gallup and so on have moved to scientific panels. So smartphone ownership has gone through the roof. Everyone has them now. And these panels can then get high response rates really quickly. There's an upfront effort to create them. This is what FlashVote does actually. They need to be random or uncorrelated to the topic. So you don't want to have that attraction to the topic. And then you need to track potential biases even over time, but they work well. And in fact, if you compare kind of affordable, more affordable over here, faster over here, panels win all the way. And this is the rest of my 5-second, that's what we do. That's why we created FlashVote to solve this problem for local governments. Okay. So individual feedback, this is your framework. Is it new? Is it true or for you? You always want it. It's never a bad thing to get feedback from an individual. Just don't confuse it with a preference of a community. Do you already know it? Is it a statement of fact? Does it pertain to your activities? New, true, and for you. And if you get all three and you need all three, then that's really useful stuff. Is there a pothole? That's great. Second report? Nah, you already knew it. I use the bike lane. That's interesting. Cool. Or I like the bike lane even. The community wants more bike lanes. Nope, that's garbage. So to get those, you can actually do anything. And if you want to do surveys even, you can ask open-ended factual questions. Did you know a good pizza place? Any ideas for the lot? Vacant lot? How would you change the service, right? Ideas. Just don't ask preference questions that end up with percentages. Who makes the best pizza? Should we build a field or a playground? That's where the open-ended engagement stuff is horrible. So for example, how supportive are you of this temporary measure? This is from an online survey we saw in California. Don't do it. It's individual preferences you're capturing. It's junk data for the community perspective. Or compare that to, are there any additional considerations, right? Knock yourself out with questions like that using online tools. Individual fact idea, it's good data. Maybe you get some gold in there. And use whatever you have. They're all good for individual input to collect individual facts, meetings, complaints, emails, and so on. But not for community preferences. Hammer that home. Never attempt to use, right? Online surveys need a special warning. They're really good actually for small, well-defined groups where you can get super high response rates and you don't need anonymity. Tennis players or things like that, but not for community preferences. So one other trick, you're going to get input from loud, noisy people. Sometimes they're going to be persistent. The magic question is, help me understand ... how doing that would benefit everyone in the community. A lot of times that will shut people down immediately because they realize they're just advocating for something that they want. Similarly, if it's a change as opposed to a new project, how would that benefit everyone in the community more than doing blank, what we're doing now or what we're planning to do or whatever? Really disarming to people. And you can ignore with scientific precision those claims about personal or community preferences. And it's hard, but you got to ignore those sentiments that you see online. You know, I don't like the cell phone tower. We don't need the cell phone tower. This is a real example from a meeting I was in where 10 angry cell phone people came. The community doesn't want or need the cell phone tower. Individual input does not equal community input. Okay, so to wrap up, which channels for which input? There's a full guide. Feel free to snapshot it right now if you want. All the channels, which ones are good for ideas and facts or preferences. The simple guide is, it's pretty simple. You want new facts, ideas, or feedback, use anything. Surveys, scientific or otherwise, engagement online, community preferences, just don't do that stuff. Only scientific surveys. And for interaction, you know, surveys aren't good for that. Do anything. Great, anything that's easy. And you get good community input, good community engagement that way. So to answer the poll, you know what? It is good data if you're looking for facts or ideas and you ask those open-ended questions. It's bad data. You'd never use it if you're looking for community preferences. So I think a lot of that sentiment was captured by your answer there. Okay. If you want a snapshot, there you go. That's your framework. Go ahead and screenshot it and feel free to screenshot that. I think we're done. Oh, one last thought, Jay.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about effective, do the right things, efficient, do those things right, equitable, different talk if you want it, but do right by all. That's really where the broad community input nips problems in the bud. Thanks a lot. Hopefully that was interesting.
It was fantastic. This is great data, and you made it so understandable, which I think is what a lot of us struggle with: is how do we get the right data? How do we solicit it and make sure that we're listening to the right voices or enough voices? And that was fantastic. The biggest question we got in the chat, I was monitoring it, and I answered a lot of the questions for you, which was,
oh, great.
Can we have the slide deck? And I assume the answer to that was yes. So
you bet.
I hope that was right. And
I'm a teacher at heart. I just take the slide deck. Thank you for asking, you know.
Well, that's wonderful. So folks, we'll post the slide deck as well as we recorded this session. We'll have all that on Tamio's website. We'll get that probably posted tomorrow. So check it out there under the Learn and Share tab of the Tamio website. As you see, there's Kevin's email address. So if you've got a specific question, Kevin, I'm going to volunteer you for this as well. But if they have a specific
don't be bashful.
To email you?
Absolutely. And I respond.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and give me your feedback. What do you like least? What do you like most? And then we can add more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff in the future talks. So we're in the feedback business too, right?
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, unfortunately, we're out of time, folks. We hit right up at noon. Let's give Kevin a big kind of virtual applause here. We really do appreciate your time and all your efforts here. And we didn't get to see you at Tamio here in Arlington this year at our conference, but we hope that you'll be in Round Rock with us next year at our conference where we can see you in person. We'll also thank TML, Lauren Grossman, and Tristan at TML, who helped us put all this together and helped promote and market it for us. Be looking in your email. We'll do another one of these webinars in September, and we'll have more details out to you a little later than that. But Kevin, again, thank you, and thank you all for participating. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, guys.